I had always thought the stories were exaggerated. Every region has its monster, its shadow in the woods that grows larger with each telling. In southern New Jersey, that shadow lives in the vast isolation of the Pine Barrens, a stretch of forest so dense and disorienting that even in daylight it feels older than the roads that cut through it. People speak of it with a tone that's half amusement, half warning. The Jersey Devil, they say. A colonial curse, a winged thing that screams in the dark. I drove in just after dusk. The highway lights thinned quickly, replaced by narrow two-lane roads swallowed by towering pines. The trees rose straight and skeletal, their trunks pale against the fading sky, their branches knitting together high overhead. There were long stretches without a single house or gas station, only forest pressing in from both sides as if reclaiming the asphalt inch by inch. I told myself I was there for atmosphere, for footage, for the thrill of standing where legend claimed something unnatural had once taken flight. The air changed the deeper I went. It wasn't colder exactly, but heavier. The scent of pine sap and damp earth filled the car when I cracked the window. My headlights carved narrow tunnels through the darkness, catching the occasional flash of movement, a deer maybe, or the shifting of branches in the wind. Nothing unusual, nothing that couldn't be explained. But the silence unsettled me. No distant highway hum, no town noise bleeding through the trees. Just the low growl of my engine and the occasional rasp of tires over uneven pavement. The Pine Barrens do not echo the way other forests do. Sound seems to disappear there, swallowed whole. I passed a weathered wooden sign marking a side road with no name, only a fading arrow pointing deeper into the woods, one on impulse, and I still don't fully understand why. I turned. The pavement gave way to packed dirt almost immediately. Branches arced overhead, scraping lightly against the roof of the car. The sky dimmed faster beneath the canopy, turning twilight into premature night. I drove slowly, careful of ruts in the path, telling myself I would go just far enough to feel the isolation and then head back. That was when I heard it, not loud, not close. A sound that didn't belong to wind or wildlife. It began as a low, drawn-out tone, something between a scream and the strained cry of metal bending under pressure. It carried across the trees in a way that felt deliberate, rising and falling unevenly before cutting off abruptly. I froze, foot hovering over the brake. The forest returned to silence so quickly it felt rehearsed. My first thought was an animal, a fox, maybe a distant coyote. There were explanations for strange sounds at night, especially in old forests. I knew that, I believed that, but the second time it came, it was closer, and whatever made it was moving, slowly, through the trees, toward me. I killed the engine without thinking. The sudden silence pressed against my ears so hard it almost rang. Without the low vibration of the car, the forest felt enormous, layered and deep and unaware. My headlights remained on, casting two pale beams down the dirt road, illuminating drifting dust and the first line of trees ahead. Beyond that, the woods swallowed everything. I told myself to listen carefully, to separate imagination from sound. For several long seconds there was nothing. Then came the faint crunch of underbrush. Not the light scattering of a rabbit, not the sharp, bounding rhythm of a deer. This was closer, this was slower, measured, something stepping with intention, placing weight carefully. The sound shifted to my left. I turned my head toward the driver's side window, straining to see beyond the glare of my own headlights reflecting off the windshield. The trees stood in rigid rows, their trunks vertical and identical in the darkness. Shadows between them seemed almost solid. Another step, closer now. I felt an irrational urge to lock the doors, though they were already locked. My hands hovered over the steering wheel, unsure whether to start the engine and leave, or stay and confirm what I was hearing. The rational part of my mind insisted this was wildlife. The Pine Barrens are home to countless animals. The stories exaggerate ordinary things. A branch snapped. The sound was sharp and unmistakable. Then the scream came again. I tore through the trees with far more force this time, high, uneven, almost metallic at the edges. It rose abruptly, dipped, then spiked into a pitch that didn't sound natural. It wasn't a howl, it wasn't a roar. It was something strained and warped, like air forced through a throat not built for it. The scream did not echo. It cut off mid-note. My headlights flickered slightly, just once, as if reacting to the vibration in the air. I felt the movement then, not directly in front of me, but circling. The underbrush shifted on the passenger side now. Whatever it wasn't charging, it wasn't fleeting. It was adjusting position, watching. A shape moved between the trees, just at the edge of the beams, tall, too tall for a deer, thin, upright for a fraction of a second before dropping lower, almost folding into itself. I leaned forward, heart pounding, trying to force my eyes to resolve it into something familiar. For an instant, I thought I saw a curve that did not belong in a forest, an unnatural arc, like the bend of a wing. The trees swallowed it again. I started the engine. The headlights brightened and the forest seemed to recoil slightly under the sudden noise. I didn't wait to confirm anything. I shifted into reverse, turning the wheel hard, tires sliding slightly on loose dirt. As I backed out, I caught one more glimpse in the side mirror. Something pale, not glowing but catching the light in a way that skin doesn't. And then it stepped fully behind a tree and disappeared. The scream did not follow me, but I had the unmistakable feeling that it could have. I didn't stop driving until I reached pavement again. The tires hitting asphalt felt like crossing some invisible boundary, like stepping back into a version of reality that made sense. Streetlights appeared in the distance, faint but reassuring. Houses with lit windows broke the suffocating wall of trees. The world felt structured again, but the sound stayed with me, even with the radio on low. I could still hear the outline of that scream in my head, the uneven rise, the metallic strain, the abrupt silence at the end. It wasn't just loud, it was wrong, as if whatever made it had learned how to imitate something human but hadn't quite gotten the details correct. Back home, I replayed the dash footage. Most of it showed exactly what you'd expect. Dirt road, pine trunks, dust drifting in headlights. The first scream registered faintly on the audio, distorted but present. The second one was clearer, enough to make me pause the video and lean closer to the screen. Then came the movement. At the edge of the frame, barely visible between two trees, something shifted. It was too tall to be a deer, too narrow to be a bear. For less than a second it appeared upright, elongated, then seemed to compress downward unnaturally like joints bending the wrong way. I slowed it frame by frame. There, just before the headlights flickered, a pale curve appeared behind the trunk of a pine. Not fur, not smooth skin exactly. It had texture, almost like stretched hide. I froze the frame. It wasn't clear enough to prove anything, but it wasn't nothing. I leaned back in my chair and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest, not pure fear, but recognition. The Pine Barrens had a reputation for a reason. For centuries, people had reported something moving those woods. Colonial accounts, farm animal mutilations, winged shapes seen across roads at night. It wasn't just campfire folklore, it was layered history. The legend traces back to the Leeds family in the 1700s, to a cursed 13th child said to have transformed into something unnatural and fled into the forest. Over time, that story grew teeth and wings, hooves, a goat-like head. bat-like appendages, a scream that curdled the air. The Jersey Devil. I had always treated it as mythology shaped by isolation. Now I wasn't so certain, because what unsettled me most wasn't that I had heard something. It was that whatever moved through those trees hadn't behaved like an animal startled by headlights. It had circled. It had adjusted its position. It had stayed just outside the light, and when I left, it hadn't chased me, which meant it hadn't needed to. I told myself I wasn't going back. That decision lasted less than 2 days. Curiosity has a way of overriding instinct, especially when instinct can't prove itself. The footage wasn't definitive. The audio could still be explained away, and yet the longer I sat with it, the more the uncertainty gnawed at me. If I had captured something real, something that fit the descriptions whispered about for centuries, walking away from it felt unfinished. So I returned. This time, I arrived earlier, just before sunset, when the Pine Barrens still held some color in the sky. The trees looked less skeletal in daylight, more like ordinary forest. Pine needles softened the ground. The air smelled clean, almost pleasant. It was easier to convince myself that whatever I had experienced had been distortion amplified by darkness. I parked near the same unmarked dirt road but left the engine running for a moment, listening. Nothing. No distant scream, no shifting underbrush, just wind moving lightly through high branches. I stepped out of the car. The forest absorbed the sound of the door closing almost instantly. Pine Barrens' silence isn't empty, it's dense. Even small movements feel significant inside it. I walked slowly around the dirt road, boots pressing into sand mixed with fallen needles. The ground was softer than I expected, loose in places, and that's when I saw it. An impression, not a clear hoof print, not a human footprint. Something elongated. The front section ended in two narrow points like split pressure marks, but the shape behind it was longer than a typical deer track. It was as if weight had been distributed unevenly, front heavy, then dragged slightly before lifting. I crouched beside it. There were 3 more impressions a few feet ahead, spaced irregularly. The stride was long, inconsistent. Whatever made them hadn't moved with the steady rhythm of a 4-legged animal. It looked almost as if something alternated between walking upright and dropping forward. A chill slid down my spine despite the daylight. The tracks led off the road into denser trees. I hesitated only briefly before following. The deeper I moved into the woods, the dimmer the light became. Pine branches knitted together overhead, filtering the sun into narrow beams that barely touched the forest floor. The air felt heavier here, still and humid. The impressions continued intermittently, sometimes clear, sometimes lost entirely in needle-covered ground, but they moved with direction, purpose. Then the forest went quiet in a way that felt wrong. No wind, no distant bird calls, just a stillness that seemed to gather around me. I straightened slowly, scanning the trees, and that was when I heard it again. Not the full scream this time, just the beginning of it. A low, rising tone, cut short, close enough that I felt it in my chest before I processed it with my ears. It wasn't in front of me, it wasn't behind me. It was somewhere above. Something shifted in the canopy. Branches swayed without wind, and for the first time, standing in daylight beneath those pines, I realized something that hadn't fully registered before. Whatever was moving through these woods didn't stay on the ground. I didn't look up right away. There's a moment when instinct tells you that seeing something will make it real in a way you can't undo. The sound in the canopy wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Branches bending under something heavier than wind, pine needles cascading down in thin showers. The air above me felt disturbed, displaced. Slowly I raised my eyes. The canopy was a lattice of dark limbs against fading light, layered and difficult to read. For a second, I saw nothing unusual, just overlapping shapes and filtered sun. Then one section lifted independently, not swaying, moving. A darker mass detached from the pattern of branches, folding inward slightly as if adjusting balance. It wasn't perched like a bird. It clung. There was tension in the way it held itself, elongated and narrow, with something extending from its sides, not fully spread, but not entirely concealed. I stepped backward without meaning to. The bark beneath it creaked softly, a limb bowed under pressure, and then I saw the head. It wasn't clear, the light was wrong for detail, but the outline was unmistakably wrong for any animal I recognized. The neck angled forward at an unnatural pitch. The silhouette suggested a long snout or muzzle, but the proportions were off. Too sharp, too narrow. The thing adjusted again, its body compressed, then expanded, and in that movement something unfolded, a membrane, thin, angular. The curve I had glimpsed in my headlights 2 nights earlier became undeniable. Not feathers, not fur. Something stretched between elongated structures, wings, but jointed in a way that didn't resemble a bat or bird. The scream erupted before I could fully process what I was seeing. This time it was direct, not distant. The sound tore downward from the branches, vibrating through the trunk beside me. It rose in jagged pitch, almost breaking, then snapped into silence again mid-breath. My body reacted before my mind did. I ran. Branches clawed at my arms as I pushed through undergrowth toward the dirt road. Behind me, something shifted with speed that didn't match its size. I heard branches snap high above, then lower, as if it had dropped levels in the canopy. It wasn't crashing wildly. It was tracking, matching my direction, keeping pace. I broke through the tree line onto the road, lungs burning, heart hammering against my ribs. The car stood 50 yards away, sunlight glinting off the windshield like a distant signal. The forest behind me went still, too still. I didn't stop running until I reached the door, fumbling for the handle, glancing back only once. Between 2 pines at the edge of the tree line, I saw it clearly for the first time. Tall, gaunt, standing upright. Its head tilted slightly to one side as if studying me, and behind its narrow shoulders, folded but unmistakable, wings. It didn't charge, it didn't flee, it simply watched. And when I slammed the car door shut and looked again, it was gone, not retreating, not hidden behind a tree. Gone, as if it had never been standing there at all, except for the branches still swaying above the place where it had been. I sat in the driver's seat longer than I cared to admit, engine running, hands locked around the steering wheel as if the simple act of gripping something solid could anchor me back to reason. The tree line stood motionless now, the swaying branches settling one by one until the forest looked ordinary again, too ordinary, as if it were correcting itself. I replayed the image in my mind, tall frame, narrow torso, the tilt of the head. It hadn't looked frantic, it hadn't looked animal in the way a startled deer or bear might. There had been awareness in the posture, deliberation, and the wings, not spread wide in threat, not flapping wildly, folded, controlled, as though flight was an option it didn't need to use. When I finally drove away, I didn't feel pursued. That unsettled me more than anything. Whatever stood at the tree line had allowed me to leave. That night, I started digging deeper. The legend most people repeat traces back to the early 1700s, to the Leeds family of the colonial New Jersey, a 13th child cursed before birth, transforming into something unnatural and fleeing into the wilderness. Over centuries, sightings layered onto that foundation. Livestock torn apart without clear predator marks, tracks in snow that began and ended abruptly, reports of a winged figure crossing roads late at night. What struck me wasn't the edge of the story, it was the pattern. There are waves, clusters of sightings that spike intensely, then fade. Periods when dozens of people report encounters within weeks, screams in the woods, shapes gliding over rooftops, something large striking barns or circling above roads, followed by long stretches of silence. A resurgence, the last major spike had been decades ago, until recently. Online forums had begun filling with new reports from southern New Jersey. Hunters describing unnatural screams, hikers claiming something paced them just beyond visibility, a delivery driver insisting a winged figure crossed his headlights near the Pine Barrens before vanishing mid-stride. The descriptions varied in detail but matched in tone: tall, thin, unnatural posture, wings that seemed almost too large for the frame, and that same warped, metallic scream. I pulled up the audio from my recording again and played it through headphones. It wasn't just loud. There was modulation in it, irregular breaks in frequency that didn't align with common wildlife calls. The pitch shifted too abruptly, like air forced through structures not built for smooth sound. And then something else occurred to me. Every modern sighting seemed to end the same way mine had. The creature never attacked. It approached. It observed. It made itself known just enough to confirm presence, and then it withdrew, as if visibility itself were the point. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the screen reflecting off the wall, and felt the weight of that realization settle slowly. What if the legend wasn't about a predator? What if it was about territory? The Pine Barrens are vast and sparsely populated. Development pushes close each year, roads cut deeper into forest, cameras, drones, hikers, hunters, more eyes than ever scanning places that once belonged entirely to silence. And in response, something begins appearing again, not attacking, not hunting, just reminding that it's still there. The idea of territory stayed with me, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in something quieter, more unsettling. The creature I had seen hadn't acted like something driven by hunger. There had been no frantic movement, no reckless aggression. It had positioned itself where I could just see it, just enough. And when I retreated, it hadn't followed. It had made a statement. A week later, I returned again, not to the same dirt road, but deeper into the outer stretches of the Pine Barrens, where development thins and the forest begins to feel less like woodland and more like an ecosystem that never invited us in to begin with. I parked near a narrow trail used mostly by hunters and walked in at dusk, this time carrying no camera mounted on the dash, no visible equipment beyond a handheld recorder and a flashlight. The air felt charged before the sun had even fully set. There's a moment in those woods when daylight doesn't fade gradually, it drops. 1 minute the trees are visible in detail, the next they are silhouettes pressed against a darkening sky. The ground underfoot shifts from textured earth to uncertain shadow. I walked slowly, listening. About half a mile in, I noticed something that made me stop cold. Silence. Not the ordinary quiet of a forest settling at night, but an absence. No insects, no rustle, no distant movement. Even the wind seemed to have pulled back. The feeling was immediate and physical, like stepping into a room where an argument had just ended. I switched off my flashlight. The darkness deepened instantly, thick and almost tangible between the trees, and then I heard it. Not the scream, breathing. Above me, slow, controlled, not labored, not animalistic in the way of panting or sniffing, measured. I tilted my head back slowly. At first I saw nothing but layered branches, then movement, a section of darkness separating itself from darker background. It shifted with a smoothness that didn't match wind. The shape adjusted its grip on the trunk. I could see more now in the dim light. The elongated limbs wrapped around bark, the narrow torso pressed close to the tree as if minimizing its profile. The wings were folded tight against its back, their edges angular and thin. Its head turned, and this time I saw the eyes, not glowing, reflective, catching what little remained and holding it unnaturally steady. They were fixed on me, not startled, not confused, assessing. The distance between us couldn't have been more than 20 feet vertically. I didn't move, I didn't run, and it didn't scream. We remained there in a strange, suspended standoff, me on the forest floor, it clinging high above like something not entirely bound by gravity. After several long seconds, it shifted. The wings loosened slightly, stretching just enough for me to understand their scale, larger than I had imagined, thin membranes drawn between elongated structures that looked too jointed, too complex for any bird. It leaned forward slightly, and then it did something that unsettled me more than any sound it had made before. It stepped downward, not climbing, not dropping, stepping, as though gravity meant less to it than it did to me. One elongated limb found a lower grip without visible strain, then another. It was descending, slowly, deliberately, closing distance, and in that moment I understood something with absolute clarity. The previous encounters had not been accidents. It had allowed me to leave. This time, it was choosing not to. I forced myself not to run. Every instinct screamed at me to break eye contact and bolt toward the trailhead. But something told me that sudden movement would shift whatever fragile balance existed between us. The creature continued its slow descent, elongated limbs, repositioning with unsettling precision. It didn't slip. It didn't test the bark cautiously. It moved as if it had done this countless times before. When it reached a height just above my own, it stopped. Its body unfolded slightly from the trunk, wings still tucked but no longer pressed tight. In the dimness, I could make out more detail than before. The frame was gaunt but not skeletal, its torso narrow yet structured, the head angled forward in a way that suggested both animal and something disturbingly aware. The muzzle, if that's what it was, tapered sharply, and when it exhaled, I saw the faintest movement in the cold air. The breathing I had heard above me had been steady, intentional. We remained frozen in that quiet standoff. The forests felt suspended around us as though every living thing had withdrawn from the immediate vicinity. Even my own breathing sounded intrusive. Then the scream began again, but not at full force. It started low, almost conversational in volume, a rising tone that vibrated in my chest more than in my ears. The pitch climbed gradually this time, not erratic like before, but controlled, as if it were testing how close it could come to a breaking point without crossing it. The sound stopped inches before it would have become unbearable. It was close enough now that I could see the slight flex in the thin membrane of its wings as it adjusted its balance. The edges were uneven, almost serrated in silhouette. No feathers, no fur, just stretched surface and bone-like structure beneath. Its head tilted again. Curiosity, not aggression. I realized then that I wasn't being hunted. I was being evaluated. The thought sent a different kind of chill through me. Predators act on instinct. This felt observational. Slowly, without breaking eye contact, I took a single step backward. The creature did not lunge. It did not retreat either. It simply tracked the movement, adjusting its stance subtly. I took another step. This time, it unfolded one wing partially, not in preparation to strike, but to rebalance itself. The span was wider than my height. In the low light, it bolted. It blotted our path out of the sky. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. Another step back, a pause. Then, as if some invisible line had been reached, it straightened. The wings folded completely, and with a sudden, fluid motion, it leapt upward, not flapping wildly, launching. The winds opened fully mid-air, stretching onto an enormous silhouette that cut across the narrow opening between trees. The membrane caught what little moonlight had emerged, revealing faint vein-like structures running through it. Two powerful beats of those wings, that was all it needed. It rose above the canopy, clearing the treetops with unnatural ease, and then it screamed, not downward at me, but outward across the forest. The sound carried in all directions, rolling over the Pine Barrens like a warning, not to me, to everything. By the time the echo faded, the sky was empty again, and I was standing alone beneath the trees, realizing with cold certainty that this resurgence wasn't random, it was deliberate, and I had just been acknowledged. I didn't sleep that night, not because I feared it would follow me home. Something told me it wouldn't, but because my mind kept replaying the encounter in slow, clinical detail. The way it descended, the restraint in its movements, the scream that had not been wild but calibrated. Nothing about it felt accidental. The next morning, reports started appearing online. A homeowner 20 miles north of where I had been describing hearing an unhealthy shriek shortly after midnight. A hunter posted about something massive crossing above the tree line near a cranberry bog. Another claimed livestock had been agitated, pacing fences and refusing to settle. The timing aligned too closely to ignore. It hadn't screamed at me, it had broadcast. That realization shifted the narrative entirely. For centuries, the Jersey Devil legend has been treated as an isolated anomaly, a cursed bird, a wandering monster, a relic of colonial superstition. But what if the pattern wasn't about haunting a single place? What if this was about cycles? The Pine Barrens are not untouched wilderness anymore. Development edges closer every year. The roads widen, drones fly overhead, trails grow busier, sound carries farther, light penetrates deeper. Territory changes, and animals, even apex predators, adopt or retreat. But what I had encountered didn't behave like something pressured into desperation. It behaved like something reasserting presence. Over the next week, sightings clustered again, brief glimpses over highways, a silhouette cutting across a full moon near the tree line, a delivery driver swearing something had landed briefly on a warehouse roof before launching back into darkness. The descriptions matched in uncomfortable ways: tall frame, elongated limbs, wings that appeared too large for the body, and that same metallic, almost mechanical scream. I returned to the edge of the Pine Barrens once more, this time not venturing deep inside. I stood near the road at dusk, watching the tree line darken as night settled. The forest looked ordinary again, almost peaceful, but I understood something now that I hadn't before. Resurgence doesn't mean chaos, it means reappearance, a reminder. And as I stood there listening to the wind thread through pine branches, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. The Jersey Devil wasn't rampaging, it wasn't attacking, it was moving deliberately across its range, showing itself just enough, leaving witnesses, reinforcing a boundary that had never truly disappeared. And somewhere beyond the visible line of trees, I had the distinct, unsettling sense that I knew I was standing there, not hidden, not afraid, just aware, waiting for the next time someone crossed too far in. I started keeping a journal, not for publication, not even for proof, just for myself, to track patterns, to capture the rhythm of sightings and the sensations that accompanied them. It became clear quickly this wasn't random. There were pulses, waves of activity that could span weeks, sometimes months, followed by long stretches of silence. People interpreted those waves differently. Some blamed hoaxes, some blamed wind or wildlife. I didn't. I had seen the way it moved, the precision, the restraint. Late one night, I drove again along a seldom used stretch of road bordering the Pine Barrens. Moonlight dappled the asphalt through thin clouds. I kept my speed low, eyes scanning the tree line. I wanted nothing more than a glimpse, just confirmation that it existed outside folklore, outside my imagination. Then the first sound hit me, low, scraping, deliberate, a noise that made the hairs along my spine rise, the kind of sound that announces presence without revealing form. I stopped, foot hovering over the brake, headlights scanned the underbrush, shadows shifted. A figure emerged briefly at the edge of the light, tall, angular, the wings folded but visible in the dim glow. It froze, head tilted, observing me, not in menace, not in curiosity, not playful. It was consideration, calculated, assessing whether I was part of its world or an intruder. I stayed put. I didn't move. I didn't breathe audibly. Time stretched, each second echoing in the still night air. The forest was alive with tension, every tree and branch holding its own secret. Then, without warning, the figure leapt upward, wings unfurling silently. It disappeared above the canopy in one fluid motion, leaving behind only the faintest movement of the air and a distant, hollow shriek that rolled across the treetops like a warning to any who dared to enter. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor in my hands. I understood then that the Jersey Devil wasn't just a legend, it was an ecosystem unto itself, an entity defining boundaries, making territory, existing just out of full comprehension. Its resurgence wasn't a fluke, it was deliberate, and I knew, without needing confirmation, that this pattern would continue long after I left the forest that night, long after any skeptic dismissed the stories as myth. The Pine Barrens had a guardian, an observer, something older than roads, older than towns, older than any human logic, and it was awake. Days turned into weeks, and the reports kept coming, scattered but persistent. People I had never met shared experiences eerily similar to mine, distant screams in the night, glimpses of movement just above treetops, the sensation of being watched without ever seeing a clear form. News outlets treated it as folklore or prankish hysteria. Online forums oscillated between mockery and obsession. I stayed mostly quiet, documenting everything in my journal, comparing locations, times, and patterns. One evening I returned once more, walking along a trail that ran parallel to a shallow creek. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest bathed in deep purple and grays. Silence pressed against me from every side, thick enough to feel like a physical weight. The first few steps were cautious, deliberate. The Pine Barrens are a place where one misstep can turn mundane sounds into panic. Then I heard it, a scraping, deliberate, closer than ever before. My pulse surged. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. There it was, partially silhouetted against the last glow of twilight, taller, angular, impossibly poised. Its wings were folded but enormous, casting strange shadows on the pine trunks. The head tilted toward me with that same unnerving awareness, eyes reflective, steady, unblinking. I froze. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet I couldn't. I was mesmerized by the precision of its posture, the controlled restraint, the intelligence emanating from its presence. It was neither attacking nor fleeing. It existed in a zone I wasn't permitted to cross. Then it moved, a slow, deliberate step to the side, adjusting its position. The scraping of claws against bark carried unnervingly through the forest. I felt the weight of its observation, not just of me, but of the surrounding territory. The forest seemed to shift with it as though everything else deferred to its authority. After a long pause, it unfolded one wing partially, stretching it outward in a slow, deliberate display. It wasn't threatening exactly, it was communicating, asserting its presence, reminding anyone who witnessed it that the Pine Barrens belonged to something far older, far more patient than human understanding. And then, without warning, it launched into the trees, rising above the canopy. The faint echo of its shriek rolled across the forest, distant yet unmistakable, a pulse of energy that lingered long after the figure vanished from sight. I stood alone once more, the weight of what I had witnessed settling like a stone in my chest. The Jersey Devil wasn't a creature of random terror. It was deliberate, calculated, alive in ways we could only glimpse and never fully grasp. And I realized, with a mixture of awe and unease, that its resurgence had only just begun. By the time I left the Pine Barrens for good, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't a simple haunting, a myth, or a story for campfires. The Jersey Devil had persisted for centuries, adapting to humans and their encroaching presence. Its appearances weren't accidents, they were measured, deliberate, and bound to a rhythm we could barely perceive. I drove out along the dirt road one last time, headlights cutting weak arcs into the thickening twilight. Every shadow between the pines felt alive, every rustle more deliberate than before. I knew it wasn't following me, yet I felt watched, not threatened, but observed. There's a difference, and it chills the marrow. In the coming days, more reports arrived, campers startled by piercing shrieks, drivers swearing a figure leapt above their headlights, ranchers hearing the flapping of wings over pastures, patterns repeated across decades. What I had experienced wasn't unique. It was part of a pulse, a long-standing presence in the heart of the Pine Barrens. I still think about it, often in the quiet moments of the night. The knowledge lingers that something so ancient, so deliberate moves just beyond our perception, choosing when and how it wants to reveal itself. The wings, the elongated frame, the metallic, piercing scream, all a signature, a reminder of territory, of endurance, of something that refuses to be forgotten. The Jersey Devil isn't gone. It never has been. It waits, adapts, and resurfaces, a shadow that thrives in darkness, a guardian of a forest older than any human memory. And I, for one, will never forget the way the forest went silent, the way it watched, and the way it made itself known, once, twice, over decades, and now again. The resurgence is not a legend, it is alive, and it continues.